What's up, punks? It's time to talk about bases, because there's just been a big announcement from Warhammer the Old World, and they're getting bigger. They've also said some things about Bretonians as well, and I thought I'd do a little video where I had a discussion about those things, and yes, I know I'm not the fastest off the bat, but you didn't come here for a 5-minute hot take, did you? You came here for a deep, long-winded, rationalist, academic, gentlemanly monologue, and that's what you're going to get. So, I think that this announcement is actually quite significant, in a symbolic way, because it signals the end of the 20mm slaughter base, which has been the sort of wargaming staple since 1984, when slaughter bases really appeared, and is something that has united all of the editions of Warhammer Fantasy, from at least 3rd edition onwards. And now these bases are going to increase to 25mm, and some of the other larger bases are also presumably going to get a bit bigger as well. So everything, or most things, are going to go to the next size up. Now, does this matter much in the grand scheme of things? In the grander scheme that Warhammer is coming back, that we're going to be able to use our old models, fight battles in the old world, have all that fun again? No, of course it doesn't matter that much. It's not that much of a big deal, and of course some people online have rather overreacted to this. But nonetheless, I do at the same time also think that it is more significant than some of the people who are maybe slightly poo-pooing some of the reactions are suggesting. Now, one of the things that's being talked about quite a lot are movement spacer trays, and essentially they are just simply trays that allow you to put, say, your 20mm dudes into a sort of a gridded pattern that simulates what it would have been like if they were on 25mm. And you could have that even on individual models or on a unit collectively. And seemingly, that solves 90 or 95% of the obvious problems that would be created by people having to, rebase armies that are on smaller bases, and obviously all of the logistical challenges that entails. Now, let's start with some of the kind of pros of, I think, this announcement. And I should say I am more anti this than I am pro this, but let's nonetheless start with the pros, because I do think there is a mixture. Now, the thing that Games Workshop give, or the reason that they give, is that it enables troops to rank up more easily. Now, this is something that's going to, I suppose, affect armies differently. Now, certainly not any of the armies I have ever owned, but some of the armies that other people have owned, I do know can be a bit of a ball ache to rank up properly. And so having a little bit more flexibility on those bases, is going to help, obviously. The other thing that I think is kind of nice about those spacer trays is that you will get a movement tray, and when you put your, say, 20mm guys on the movement tray, they will take up exactly the amount of space on the battlefield that they should take up. Whereas if you use a conventional movement tray and stick your guys in it, they take up a slightly larger footprint. And sometimes in competitive play, that can create sometimes some arguments sometimes about whether something can charge something or not when it comes down to a fraction of an inch, which, very frequently actually it does. So that's kind of nice that we've got maybe an opportunity to, for a movement-based unit, to just simply take up the amount of space that it is on the table. Also, fairly self-evidently, you've got more scope for being a bit more inventive with your bases if the bases are bigger. I mean, a 20mm base is very difficult to do that much creative with. A 25mm base and a larger base is a bit more straightforwards to do some creative stuff on basing. And, a lot of people really enjoy doing basing on their models. It's quite an easy thing to get good at. It's something that, can give the army a feeling of unity, all that kind of stuff. Bases are really cool. And now maybe there's going to be a little bit more flexibility in regards to those things. Now, as regards to the cons, I'm going to list, I think, a few. Now, I should say that these don't matter that much. I am maybe being a little bit nitpicky with some of them. But, hey, we've been waiting for this for, 3 or 4 years or something. It's nice to have something to talk about, so I guess let's talk about it. Now, the first point is about scale creep. Now, the article on the Warhammer community says that while the bases are getting bigger, the models actually aren't getting bigger, which seems to me a little bit odd, because there are obvious advantages of models getting a little bit bigger. They're easier to paint, you can be a bit more dynamic with them, etc. But they say they're not doing that, they're just increasing the base sizes. Now, I guess first of all, increasing the base size is a form of scale creep, even if the models stay the same. And also, I just tend to think that throughout all of Warhammer, history, models were gradually getting bigger over time. I mean, you can quite easily see that. It's not that dramatic, but I think with also more roomy bases, I think the temptation for models to grow a little bit will be quite considerable. And so I won't be that surprised if there is a little bit of effective scale creep. And, scale creep's not a problem. Particularly. It's a problem when you start to put models together that are of different kind of scales, but if you have different units that are of different scales, it doesn't necessarily matter an enormous, amount in the grand scheme of things. There's then obviously, the obvious time and expense of either rebasing or your armies, or I suppose, buying these spacer trays and decorating them. That's a fairly obvious kind of point. But again, don't think it's really a particularly big deal. I'm sure the market will provide very cheap, good spacer trays, for a few pounds a pop, and so it's not going to be an enormous investment unless you really have an absolutely colossal kind of army, as I guess some people do. The second point, I think, is about aesthetics. Now, this is something I've been doing a bit of experiments with. So I've got a spacer tray, and I've tried putting some of my troops in. So I'm painting some wood elves at the moment, some sort of 80s wood elves archers, and I put them in the spacer tray. They looked great. In fact, they probably looked better than they would have done without the spacer tray. Why? Because, wood elves don't really fight in tight formations, do they? There are lots of dudes, who are quite individual with their bows pointing in lots of different directions. A little bit more space between the models actually probably makes them look better. But when I tried it with my Chaos Warriors, it looked a little bit less good, and I think that's because something like Chaos Warriors, or to a much greater extent, for example, High Elf Spearmen or Dwarven Warriors, where you've got quite a lot of uniformity between the models, they've got like a shield, they've got like a weapon, they're very much designed to fight in kind of close formations, and indeed those kind of warriors, especially spear and pike arm warriors, would have done that historically. And so separating them slightly expands the density of the formation, and so actually I think makes some of those troops look a little bit less good. But it's kind of swings and roundabouts. Also, maybe to be a bit anally retentive about it, I based a lot of my stuff a long time ago, so now on my baser trays I'm going to have to try and get really quite narrow lines of the same ground that go between each guy and try and make them look united with the rest of my unit. And that might be kind of a boring and not very, interesting job. But, it's not an enormous problem, in the grand scheme of things. Third point, again, a small problem with larger bases. I assume that they're not going to go and tell us that our 6x4 foot tables are getting bigger. So what that will mean is that the armies on the battlefield will take up a larger proportion of the overall size of the battlefield than they did before. Now, does this matter that much? Again, not really, but if you play armies often that I do, where have a lot of small multiple units on, where you're using maneuverability quite a lot, it's presumably going to mean that there are going to be maybe less, gaps between regiments and things that you can maybe get sort of funky with your new troops on larger bases. But it's only relatively fractional. The whole of an army's battle line, might expand by, 6 inches or something like that. So there'll be a little bit less space than there was before, but, probably not too bad. Now, the next 2 points that I guess I have some misgivings with are more substantial ones, and neither of these are ones I've seen, commented on really on the, on the internet so far. I think the first one is that let's just think about the practicalities of what's going to happen when this new game comes out. There are going to be lots of new miniatures that are going to be sold with the new, larger, correct bases. And then there are going to be people who are playing who have either rebased their armies or who are using these movement trays that sort of expand the base sizes. And then there are going to be people who haven't done those things and are just using, their old, smaller base guys on, on normal movement trays or no movement trays. And you're going to have those two kinds of armies fighting each other on tabletops. One of them is going to have a larger base size than the other. And this does matter a bit in gaming terms. Because if you have smaller bases, generally you have an advantage. Why? Because you get more guys attacking in a smaller kind of frontage. There are some disadvantages as well. You'll suffer more damage if you get hit with a template weapon. Your arc of sight will be a little bit narrower if you've got a smaller frontage. But generally, you want bases to be smaller. And so the people who haven't either rebased their armies or put them on these new movement trays or got the newer models will have a slight competitive advantage when they start playing. And so you're going to have this slightly messy kind of situation where kind of old and new both kind of fight each other. And, again, it's not an insurmountable problem. I just think it might be a bit messy, especially because the people who haven't upgraded their armies will have a competitive advantage. But again, we shouldn't over-egg the pudding, because if you do go into a competitive environment, obviously it's just going to be mandatory to either rebase or put your models on those movement trays in order to, be allowed to use stuff in the competition. But for casual games, I can see it having a small effect sometimes, and sometimes those fine margins can matter. And so it just seems to me that this is creating a slightly messy situation right at the beginning when everyone is trying to either get into the game or get back into the game that, is something that probably could have just been avoided by keeping the bases the same size. But again, it's not a massive issue. Now, the final point I have is, I think, a slightly more substantial one, which is that encouraging people to rebase their armies, which, let's face it, is going to be the way of making them look the nicest, and also bringing out all these models on bigger bases, is going to discourage backwards compatibility, which is to say that it's going to be more difficult to use your large-based Warhammer the Old World armies to go and play 8th edition, 6th edition, 3rd edition, whatever old editions of Warhammer Fantasy you fancy. Now, for many people, they're just going to immediately say, I don't give a damn. I'm not going to be playing an older edition. That for me, Warhammer is something that's, live, it's current. I play the edition that is the one that's supported. And that's going to be the attitude, I think, of 90% of players. But there are quite a few players, like me, who are really interested in the history of the game. And while I envisage that most of what I play will be Warhammer the Old World when it comes out, I like the idea of playing some other games as well. 3rd Ed, 8th Ed, 6th Ed, the 9th Age. And all of those, obviously, will be on smaller bases. And so that's going to be a little bit tricky. Now, you might say to me, well, Dr. Blacksil, all you need to do is just use those movement spacer trays. They're the panacea for all. You don't need to rebase your models. And yet, you'll be right. But, it takes two to tango. It takes two to play a game of Warhammer. And so it's going to be maybe a little bit more difficult to actually find, opponents who haven't, multi-based their models in that way, or used or changed the sort of the basing sizes for you to play with on a kind of even terms. And so it's going to make it a little bit more difficult for two players to both have equivalent armies and old base sizes where you can go back into the past and play an old edition. And I very much like the facility of doing that. And I like the idea that all of the editions of Warhammer Fantasy, or at least since 3rd edition anyway, are part of the same family, that they can visit each other. And you can, enjoy those models to some extent with some interoperability, even though some units have been and gone over the years. And this represents a little bit of a kind of harder break between the old and the new. And, it makes it a little bit more difficult to go backwards and only really forwards into the brave new world of the old world. And so that's something I don't really like that much. And so I suppose overall with the bases, just to conclude my thoughts on that, it's not a big deal. I think some people who are kind of despairing at it are maybe slightly overreacting. I think some people who are just whipping out the spacer trays and saying, hey, this is the panacea for all of your problems, are slightly misrepresenting some of the concerns. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's really that important. And I'm still massively looking forward to Warhammer the Old World and still very optimistic about it. Now, to move on to a second point I wanted to talk about, which is about the Bretonians. And obviously this article, as well as the base sizes, also had quite a bit about Bretonia as well. And, I'm a Bretonian player. I'm very interested in Bretonians. As you know, Bretonians have not had, a supported army book since the early noughties. And that's, a very, very long time. And no new models since then as well. Fortunately, because the Bretonian range of models has always been so gorgeous in 6th edition and in the Perry era, and to be honest, before that as well, it probably hasn't mattered so much that we've not had updated models. And actually, in this article, they show some of the old favourites. We've got some Pegasus Knights, some Men-at-Arms, the Trebuchet, some Knights of the Realm of the 6th edition kind of vintage. And it's lovely to see some of those models on square bases, or slightly larger bases, admittedly, on, an official kind of Games Workshop site there as a supported thing. It's just a little nominal thing, but that makes me happy. Now, most of the things we've heard about Bretonnians, or all of them actually, are all good, as far as I'm concerned, to be a little bit more positive perhaps than I was with the bases. Now, the first thing I think that really stood out for me when I saw this picture of a Bretonnian army on the table is, whoa, the triangle lance formation is back. For those of you not familiar with that, in 4th edition and 5th edition, when Bretonnians got a new revamped rulebook written by Nigel Stillman, Bretonnians fought in that version of the lance formation, where you had 1 knight in the front, then 2 knights, then 3 knights, then 4 knights, etc. in subsequent ranks, or 5 knights, I think, to create this really dynamic-looking triangular formation, which, to my mind, was heaps cooler than the sort of 3-wide formation you had from 6th edition onwards. Now, I think the only issue with the lance formation is that, for those of you old enough to remember how this played in 5th and 4th edition, it was a bit messy, as you might imagine, when it got into combat. So, first thing was that its arc of sight was from the knight right at the front, so it had a really narrow arc of sight. Kind of cool in a way, because it does sort of make sense that it would be easy to get out the arc of sight of dudes that are fighting in a formation where they're really dependent on one guy at the front to kind of be a pathfinder for them to smash into the enemy. But it could sometimes get a little bit awkward in subsequent rounds of combat. Do you keep the lance formation as it is in a triangle, or if the enemy hold, do you then have to go into a more conventional formation? So I'll be really interested to see how they manage that from a rules perspective, because it looks super cool, but it is also a little bit potentially messy as well. The next thing they mentioned, just as a little aside in the article, they mentioned that Knights of the Realm would go on foot as well as on horses. Yes, that's fantastic. So Footnights, were part of the 3rd Ed feudal sort of Bretonnians, and, there were some really cool Footnight models. Knights Forlorn in 9th Age as well, also a kind of cool Footnight unit. And so there's a definite obvious missing thing there, I think, with Bretonnians. They always really should have had a Footnight unit. The other thing I think they should have is a kind of sort of monk unit as well, a kind of like slightly, drunk kind of battle monk kind of unit. I'd like to see something like that. But Footnights, nice to see them back. You've been gone far too long. Also in the article, they banged on a little bit about colour schemes. Now, traditionally, Bretonnian knights all had their own different colour schemes and coats of arms. And of course, that goes back into the very rich kind of medieval tradition of a knight having, sort of his house, his lineage, his family's coat of arms that would make each knight unique. In this article, they talk about the old world being set at a time where maybe more Bretonnian knights fought under, the king or a duke's kind of banner, and so maybe subsumed their own kind of livery into something a bit more uniform. But at the same time, they're also very minded to point out that questing knights and grail knights are probably likely to have their own kind of liveries, because these are obviously kind of much bigger kind of knights that maybe should be a bit more individualistic. Now, in terms of what I think about that, now, I've always liked the lore aspect of each Bretonnian knight being unique. I think that that's really, really cool. But on the battlefield, even though my own Bretonnian knights are all pretty unique, I've tended to rank them up with colour schemes. And that's really just because it's easier for my opponent to tell, well, the blue ones are the Knights Errant, the red ones are the Knights of the Realm, the green ones are the Grail Knights. And so I don't mind a bit more kind of uniformity being encouraged for the more mundane parts of the Bretonnian army, like Knights of the Realm downwards, basically. But at the same time, in a lore sense, I do prefer, the kind of individual knights. But I like that they discuss that in some detail in the article. I think it's quite respectful to the old lore, that when they're making a departure from that, they discuss quite a lot why they've done that, and they also indeed even have these sort of alternative kind of army lists which are hinted at here for sort of exiling and crusading kind of armies, which might enable you to, if you wanted to be really historically minded, have all your different kinds of knights. And so I like the fact that they're kind of sensitive to that kind of thing. But moreover, you can do what you like, with a hobby. You can paint all your knights individually if you want to, or you can go for something more uniform. But I liked the discussion there. I thought it was fluffy, I thought it was cute, I thought that it was historically respectful to where Bretonnians have gone from. And I always like those historical kind of callbacks, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of history that's being drawn on in this game, and, being respectful to that history, not just the lore of the old world, but also the history and traditions of Warhammer Fantasy as a game going through the ages, is, I think, kind of quite important here. While, change and progress can and should happen, I think being respectful to the past is perhaps particularly important in a game like this. The final thing I think it mentioned, which I just kind of hinted at there, was this Exile and Crusade kind of armies. Now, I'm sort of thinking that maybe that means they might have, I don't know, thematic army lists or something like that. Or maybe, I don't know, if your general is a questing knight or something, maybe you can have a Crusade army. I'm not sure that quite makes sense. Or if your general is a certain kind of knight who's fallen on hard times, maybe you can have an exiled knight's army or something. And so, that would be kind of cool to be able to have, thematically different kind of army lists that are nonetheless sort of balanced and, suitable for competitive play, within, the same kind of book. And so, really, all of the stuff that I saw from Bretonia, I really liked it, both in terms of substance and in terms of tone. And yeah, I think that's pretty much a wrap. I've got Chantal the Prophetess here, from my Bretonian Army videos, and I brought her on here because I rather wondered, well, Chantal, you're on a 20mm base, aren't you? Would you like the idea of going for the next size up? Getting a kind of upgrade? Oh, well, that's somewhat unrepeatable, I'm afraid, so I'll keep that from you. But, I think there's every reason to still be extremely optimistic and onwards and upwards, and see you on the old world, or in the old world. Maybe on the wrong end of a lance formation that's at a triangle. Okay, cheerio.